Thank you. Checks in the mail, what do I say? It's a particular pleasure to be here this morning. I have to say that when Academic Dean Dan Russ invited me to speak, he asked for a title, and for some reason I rashly promised to make sense of the discord and discourtesy in our political system. I don't know if I can deliver in the sense of making it all sound rational, because in politics, passions and power compete with reason. But I'll have to let you be the judge of that. Senator Mitch McConnell, Republican from Kentucky, minority leader in the US Senate the last several years, captured the tone of American politics in our time when he declared that, I quote, several years ago, "The single most important thing we want to achieve is for President Obama to be a one-term president." And he went on to explain why Republicans had refused to provide any votes in support of one set of the president's proposals. "We worked very hard to keep our fingerprints off of these proposals," McConnell said, "because we thought, correctly I think, that the only way the American people would know that a great debate was going on was if the measures were not bipartisan. When you hang the bipartisan tag on something, the perception is that differences have been worked out and there's a broad agreement on the way to go forward." I should bring that up, shouldn't I? At the Democratic Convention the other night, and I hope you saw him, the best communicator politically in America, former President Bill Clinton also quoted Senator McConnell and referred to his declaration as a rare moment of candor, thanking the senator for being willing to admit what many politicians are eager to practice. Senator McConnell is convinced that a great debate is going on in American politics, a battle for the soul of the republic. A great divide exists between Republican and Democrat, he insists. Stark choices have to be made. America's divided decisively into red and blue. There's a right approach, and therefore there's a wrong approach. And that being so, his goal, he says, unapologetically, is to win, not to reach agreement across the aisle, especially if reaching agreement across the aisle would give the other side a victory. McConnell was willing to go public with his goals and his strategy, but politicians of both major parties play the power game of politics the same way. So for the last several decades, victory at all costs has competed against an older vision of deliberation, debate, and decision, with plenty of disagreement, but that disagreement being handled with some degree of civility. As recently as the 1990s, President Clinton and the Republican Congress hammered out, that's probably the right expression, hammered out major reforms and of the welfare system, forged a North American free trade agreement, and found a way to balance the budget. It was not pretty watching the sausage being made. But even that grudging bipartisanship of the 90s is now hard to find. President Obama's signature achievements the last 4 years were done with next to no Republican support. Now, the idea that policy making consists of these simple binary options may be news to you. You may have thought that the sagging economy could never be revived by some silver bullet single act, and that being the complex thing an economy is, its health is a function of many factors. Public confidence to engage in economic activity, business confidence, the state of other economies whose businesses and individuals, populations buy from us or sell to us, the level of taxation, the extent of various kinds of government regulation, the indebtedness of families, including the change in the value of the homes that they live in, the salaries offered for jobs that are available, the level of services provided by the government, and right down to the local level where items like the fees charged for a teenager to play high school athletics now have to be factored into a family's decision-making, and on and on. If you have a working knowledge of American politics, you'll also know, that's where I should give a shout out to Politics 104, right? You will also know that the president has relatively few powers to shape economic affairs directly, that those he does have, he shares with the Congress, and he needs their cooperation to act. You'd also know that the central bank, the Federal Reserve exercises independent control over the supply of money through setting interest rates, and that the president has no control over this. So, taking all that together, you might want to say that the economic stimulus, the bailouts of major banks and car companies that took place early in the Obama administration's time in office would be far better explained as practical steps to try to respond to a crisis, or some such language, rather than steps taken from some ideological playbook. But Senator McConnell wants none of this way of thinking. He wants us to think that the fate of the republic hangs on what people would choose to do 60 days from now. For him, and for many of his party, one way leads to socialism, the other to, well, America. And let me be even-handed about this. Democrats, too, talk and act this way. These party line votes, where all the Democrats vote one way and all the Republicans vote the other, were a feature of the Bush years as well as the Obama years. Playing this zero-sum game is a common pattern in American politics. It looks likely to continue. So let me try to explain why. To begin with, if you're going to have a bipartisan discussion, as so many of us seem to want to think we want those discussions, bipartisan discussions that would lead to bipartisan agreement, at least over the issues like those I've been talking about, you have to have incentives that promote both the discussion and the agreements. For several decades, a constitutional requirement has been used to remove the incentive to cooperate. The requirement is the census. Completed every 10 years, it results in a redistricting of congressional seats according to changes in the population of states. So Massachusetts, for example, at the most recent census, just lost one of its congressional seats because, relatively speaking, the population of other states grew faster than ours. So we're down from 10 to 9. Redistricting, figuring out the new seats, changes the incentives to reach agreement because those in charge of it are the political parties at the state level. And they use redistricting to strengthen their positions. They redistrict to make each party stronger in the seats it now holds. 200 years ago this year, Massachusetts, you might say, wrote the book on redistricting when this famous cartoon appeared. It's called The Gerrymander, and it was named for Elbridge Gerry, Massachusetts Paul, who shaped what I think the cartoonist imaginatively described as a salamander-shaped district. I'm sure if you're up on your salamanders, maybe it looks like it, maybe it doesn't, to build a permanent majority in his favor. So he strung together a district from Salisbury up at the top right, all the way down to Lynn, and apparently Hamilton, Wenham, Beverly, we're a bit suspect because we don't have enough people who would likely vote for him. So he built this district around this part of the North Shore to secure a permanent majority. That is happening across the country. It's been happening for decades. One by one, moderate Democrats and moderate Republicans are being gerrymandered out of existence. They're either losing to redder or bluer candidates of their own parties in the primary elections, or they're deciding that the partisan atmosphere in Congress is just too hostile, or the districts being reshaped every 10 years are being made more conservative or more liberal under their own feet, and they no longer fit. Earlier this year, for example, in a rather striking case, Senator Richard Lugar of Indiana was rejected by voters in favor of a more conservative candidate, and Lugar had served in the United States Senate for several decades. Much closer to here, Senator Olympia Snowe, the Maine Republican, announced this would be her final year in the U.S. Senate, and she cited the polarized partisan climate as a major reason for her decision. On the Democratic side, so-called blue dog Democrats, that is, what used to be the conservative, largely southern wing of their more liberal party, they're vanishing from Congress, or some of them are turning into Republicans. So moderates on both sides of the aisle are an endangered species. Here's a snapshot of what I've just been talking about, the redistricting effect, this one over 3 decades. Back in 1968, the upper of the two figures, the two parties had their differences as they do now. Democrats were liberals and Republicans were conservatives, not quite so purely as we see it now. But there was a lot of overlap in that gray area between the two peaks representing the two political parties. 3 decades later, that's the lower figure, that overlap had almost vanished as the parties kept pulling towards the polls and away from the center. Today, incidentally, using the same measures for scoring members of Congress, these were devised by Keith Poole and Howard Rosenthal, political scientists, the two parties don't actually touch at all. There's clear blue water between them on this ideological measure. Redistricting, gerrymandering, the way we do it in the US, ought to worry us for another reason. Right? I mean, if you go back to the gerrymander, what you're seeing there is a reversal of a core democratic principle of democratic politics. Democracy, as you all know, I don't need to tell you, is supposed to be a form of government in which the people choose their representatives. But redistricting, the way we do it, allows the representatives to choose the voters most favorable to them. You know there's not a lot of popular control when 95% of members of Congress running for re-election win it, and that's the current figure, and it's been that way for quite a long time. I said a moment ago that bipartisanship is about incentives. So think about it. If your district is bright red, you don't get re-elected by reaching across the aisle and making bipartisan agreements with the other party. If your district is true blue, the voters won't thank you for making concessions to the other side. No, you get re-elected by appealing to the majority in your district, which your party has helped make larger with every redistricting. Notice I'm adding this third figure. The polarized Congress is not the polarized public. Most Americans' political views are spread out on a spectrum from left to right, to the extent that you can measure them using this sort of ideological measure. Quite large numbers are more or less in the middle. Party polarization then distorts this picture. What this third one shows is a phenomenon that drags the parties towards the extremes, just like redistricting does, but for a slightly different reason. As I mentioned earlier, and as you all know, in the American system, elections operate in 2 stages. We have primary elections first, and what they do is they choose the candidates who will run in the general election under their party's banner. Well, most eligible voters do not vote in primary elections. The percentage of turnout in primary elections is often very low. However, activists vote in primary elections, and Democratic activists are more liberal than Democratic rank-and-file voters, and Republican activists are more conservative than the Republican rank-and-file. So primary elections also help exaggerate the red-blue divide. And you can see that on the table where the 2 peaks there are the activists in each party, and the dotted line is the general public. It's interesting that most citizens don't share the ideological locations of the activists and the party leadership. In one of the sadder commentaries, I think, on the state of American politics, close to half of those eligible to vote decide not to do so in elections at all. And from the point of view of being well represented, you can sort of understand such a decision. Some of you, it's another reference to Politics 104, will know that I prefer a system that fixes this problem not by abolishing parties, I don't think parties are the problem, but by going to a system that gives us several, not 2. There's no question that having a 2-party system has served to turn politics even more sharply into a zero-sum competition, the kind that Mitch McConnell understands so well, where people, though, are simply not well represented. But that's really another story for another time. Redistricting gerrymandering is part of the picture of the red-blue divide in 2012, but it's not the whole of it. A larger piece of the puzzle is made up of the issues themselves. Right? Half a century ago, a new kind of issue arrived on the American political agenda, civil rights. Now, the alert historians out here will say, wait a minute, what do you mean arrived then? What about the end of slavery? Of course, that's right. A civil rights movement did follow the end of slavery. There was federal civil rights legislation. But civil rights laws fared very poorly at that time, and quite quickly they had been weakened by the courts and replaced by the system of legal segregation known as Jim Crow. The 20th century civil rights movement then brought, I'm saying, a different kind of issue and a different way to resolve this kind of issue into the political spotlight. You don't secure basic rights by compromise, the way most lawmaking gets done in democratic systems. Compromise is usually possible on most issues because you can increase that and cut this and add an amendment here and adjust something else to accommodate various perspectives on an issue. It's like the economic dispute between the management and the workforce. There may be lots of disagreement, lots of raised voices, threats of strikes, threats of lockouts, but in the end, both sides usually have room to maneuver and reach agreement. So the workers demand 5%, the management offers 3%, and though it's messy, each side can make concessions and perhaps arrive somewhere in the middle. But you can't do that with rights. To compromise is to lose everything. In our system, rights are fundamental. Rights are the main check on government power. Think property, think privacy, think equality. Think about the gun rights advocate who sees every regulation as the first step towards destroying the Second Amendment right altogether. Or the gay rights advocate for whom the only legitimate expression of equality for gay persons has to be marriage, nothing less. Or the zero-sum struggle over abortion that persists, of course. I remember President Bill Clinton seeking common ground, as he hoped for, on abortion. He thought he'd found it in a simple formula. We want abortion, he said, to be legal, safe, and rare. Sounds like a compromise, sounds like heading to the middle. But that common ground won't hold as soon as someone asks a simple question. Safe? Well, for whom? Civil rights brought this new no-compromise attitude into the heart of politics. And while some rights may be bogus or contrived, we can be grateful that genuinely fundamental rights do uphold citizens' created dignity, give them space to take up their responsibilities, follow their consciences, give them equality under the law. Well, many of these rights are very important indeed. But a basic strategy shapes all the rights movements, the women's movement, the pro-life movement, whatever. Rights disputes don't go to legislatures, they go to courts. Laws are challenged in court as violations of the alleged right, and if you win, the courts strike down or restrict laws that interfere with the right. But rights politics doesn't confine its effects or its tone to civil rights, abortion, gun rights, women's rights, gay rights, or freedom of religion. The logic and language of rights has entered the mainstream of our politics too. 20 years ago, Harvard law professor Mary Ann Glendon put it this way. She said, "It used to be that neighbors who got into a disagreement used to work it out over the garden fence. Now they reach for their lawyers." She might have added, "Now we really don't have neighbors anymore anyway, so thin is the American concept of membership." Rights politics, you see, discourage debate, discussion, and compromise, and replace those with, "I'll see you in court." You can't solve a common problem without at least some common ground. This year's Republican and Democrat platforms, the official declaration of the positions the parties take on leading issues, nicely illustrate the polarization I've been describing. On major issues, there's almost no common ground. Immigration, abortion, Israel, marriage, religion, and of course the economy are all presented to their supporters in uncompromising black and white, or I should say red and blue, ways. The either-or mindset percolates down to issues where bipartisan agreement was once reached. Let's stay local. In Massachusetts, not so long ago, then Governor Romney helped launch the push for a law that provided universal health insurance, complete with a mandate that required every citizen of the Commonwealth to carry it, and he signed that bill into law. That law became the model for the federal law called the Affordable Care Act, and without too much exaggeration, Obamacare is Romneycare. But the polarized system has had Mr. Romney running away from his own creation because his party opposes the Affordable Care Act, so Romney has to oppose it too if he wanted to become the Republican nominee. Now let me be clear, I do think that some rights claims are bogus, and that when the courts move too quickly, they can shut down debate that should be opened up instead. And unlike the effects of redistricting described earlier, which I think are almost entirely negative the way we do it, differences on matters of what should constitute basic rights and fairness often reflect principles that should be defended stoutly, however much they expose big differences in worldview. Rights politics, redistricting. They explain the red and blue polarization pretty well, but I don't think they provide the whole picture. For that, we have to go back to the nation's founding, something our political parties and their leaders are eager to do with hardly any encouragement. I'm talking about freedom, the flag, and the founders. And thanks to Keith Crass for these images. I really appreciate them. They've worked the variety and the solemnity nicely into it all. Every culture has its unifying myths, those stories and symbols that reinforce what it means to be one of us. I could be wrong. Mine's not a scientifically based claim, but more like a foreigner's observation. Few countries can display their flag in quite as many ways as Americans do. On public buildings, in churches, on backpacks, on backsides. And none of these displays are thought of as a desecration. Each is a sort of celebration. The flag drapes the coffins of the war dead. It's unfurled at ball games. It's saluted in the corner of classrooms. Such widespread display makes it inevitable that the flag and everything associated with it, the values associated with it, will make its way into politics, and I'm claiming, and would make mischief. The United States founding represented both a military and a philosophical revolution. The ideas embraced by the Declaration of Independence echo that revolutionary shift to modern ways of thinking about how people and authority ought to be related to each other. Rejecting the norms of traditional societies where you don't choose your membership in society, the American founding declared that free choice by free human beings is the only legitimate foundation a society could have. What's the problem, I imagine you thinking? Sounds very good to me, right? Free choice by free people should be the only legitimate foundation for a society. How could this possibly work mischief in politics? It can work mischief, I suggest, because patriotic appeals introduce the language of loyalty into the heart of politics. Ask not what your country can do for you, and so on. But if it introduces the language of loyalty, it also must introduce the language of treachery. And American political history is full of these appeals. Americans are strongly committed, I'm sure you'd agree, to keeping government as limited as possible, self-government as broad as possible, but they're equally eager to see that everyone gets a fair shake in society. Individual freedom, choice, opportunity. This is our consensus. This is the common commitment we have. What we disagree about is not the idea of freedom, opportunity, and choice in the abstract, but the strategy for realizing it, expanding it, protecting it in law and public policy. You see, pick the wrong strategy, and your opponents won't stop at criticizing it as unwise or imprudent or not very effective. but they'll be strongly tempted to go further and denounce it as disloyal or un-American. Back to health insurance. Is the mandate for everyone to buy health insurance a reasonable way to enable coverage to be extended to those with pre-existing medical conditions who would be severely burdened without it? Yes, of course, says one party. We're all Americans. We all need to help each other. It's a price worth paying. No, absolutely not, says the other. It's an invasion of our liberty. It's the first step down that slippery slope to an un-American form of government that picks our doctors and rations our care. We heard a lot of that the last few years. All this has also been on display at the Republican and Democratic conventions these last 2 weeks. There's strong agreement on liberty, choice, and opportunity in the abstract, and it's been wrapped and rewrapped in the flag by speaker after speaker. But there the agreement ends. For Republicans, there's a deep-seated, and I believe a genuinely deep-seated concern that if government is enlisted to help support liberty, choice, and opportunity the wrong way, the result will be its opposite: dependence and diminished incentive to acquire the elementary virtues needed to make a good life. This, they fear, is what the Democrats will inflict on the country if they win, and that's un-American. On the Democratic side, speakers equally committed to the values of liberty, opportunity, and choice tried strenuously to defend the position that when government extends a helping hand, real help arrives, not dependency, not socialism. And Democrats paint the Republicans' rugged individualism as the law of the jungle, turning the American society into a raw competitive arena where you're on your own. In such a hostile environment, only the strong can survive. And this, of course, cannot be the America we know and love. Our common values are founding as what Seymour Martin Lipset many years ago called the first new nation. Bring into our political debate themes of loyalty and treachery that easily get out of hand. I submit that's exactly what they've done. Writing in Harper's Magazine in 1964, historian Richard Hofstadter had a name for the politics produced by this combination of agreement on abstract values and disagreement on practical implementation. He dubbed it the paranoid style in American politics. I quote, "I call it the paranoid style simply because no other word adequately evokes the sense of heated exaggeration, suspiciousness, and conspiratorial fantasy that I have in mind." And he went on, "The paranoid spokesman sees the fate of conspiracy in apocalyptic terms. He traffics in the birth and death of whole worlds, whole political orders, whole systems of human values. He's always manning the barricades of civilization. He doesn't see social conflict as something to be mediated and compromised, since what's at stake is always a conflict between absolute good and absolute evil. What's necessary is not compromise, but the will to fight things out to a finish." So the paranoid style is not new. It's as old as the United States. Think of it. It surfaced in the bitter struggles over the Alien and Sedition Acts, passed by the Adams administration at the end of the 18th century with the ink hardly even dry on the Bill of Rights, and in the recurring xenophobia over immigration, in the Red Scare after World War I and the McCarthy hearings after World War II to ferret out communists in the government and society and Hollywood. It doesn't serve our political order well at all. The long history of American politics of appealing to first principles, invoking the founders, wrapping issue positions in the flag, completes my summary of the forces, long-term and short-term, that paint the political scene in red and blue. What I've tried to offer, an explanation of our sour political discourse, is redistricting, rights talk, and the persistence of the paranoid style. But I can't end without anticipating some questions, or particularly the question, well, what might be done about this? How are we to make good choices in elections that are framed by these kinds of political forces? How can we make constructive use of analyses like this one for the decisions that most of us are going to make in 60 days from now? And there they are. I offer some closing thoughts. No law, no constitution, however well crafted, and I believe the American Constitution to be well crafted, will eradicate the struggle for power. whose roots seem to lie in human rebellion and sin. The framers of the Constitution, I think, knew this and managed it. They checked power, they balanced it. But they never pretended that agreement could replace the power struggle completely. What they hoped to achieve instead was a process for reaching decisions that rubbed off the rougher corners of the power struggle. And even in today's ugly political climate, the mitigating influence of checking and balancing can still influence policy for good. It still can work. Faced with the poisonous atmosphere in our politics, then, what should Christians do? Should they withdraw and simply keep their own house in order? Historically, and I think unfortunately, Christians haven't needed much encouragement to do just that, especially those of us of an evangelical persuasion. New Testament theologian Tom Wright urges Christians to think again, to stay in, and to engage. The world works best, he insists, when ruled by wise stewards, human beings who are humble before God and hence effective in bringing fruitful order to this world, to his world. Whether President Barack Obama or Governor Mitt Romney know it, they are contending for the job of steward. Every attack ad issued in a candidate's name needs to be held up against that standard. As steward, the successful presidential candidate has clear but limited responsibility. It's not responsible to be a steward of everything. Government cannot do well more than a few functions. It's poorly suited to raise children or run businesses, but it is well suited to administer justice, to defend the nation against attack, and to practice prudent financial stewardship. Prudence, I think, also guides it to, historically it has, to construct safety nets for imperfect economic systems and other institutions that break. And to the best of my understanding, theologically, all human institutions are broken. So we have divorce law, and we have child welfare, and we have bankruptcy laws and other forms of debt forgiveness, just by way of a few examples, not because government should run families or is good at running families and businesses, but because families and businesses and all institutions in this fallen world break. For these reasons, too, government must be limited, because government can't be given too much power either. So, try to pick the better steward and resist and analyze the claims trumpeted from the parties and the super PACs that this candidate or that candidate will save the republic. It's not about that. The most constructive opportunity you should have in the campaign itself to tune out the polarization of the parties will be during the debates. In those forums, the two candidates will have the opportunity to address each other. Don't be surprised to find that President Obama and Governor Romney are more than capable of civil debate. In spite of all the red-blue hostility and the polarizing of politics, it just so happens this year both our candidates are centrists. The president is a policy wonk, I think of him that way. Mr. Romney is so clearly a manager. Neither are ideologues. Come watch the debates with us in the political science department and let's see what we can learn. In quite a different vein, and this is my closing point, if the two candidates are competing for the job of steward in this very important task of extending care and nurture and replenishment to the agencies through which people live their lives, Christians can review the candidates' applications from the perspective of the true king. I refer, of course, to King Jesus. Rubens' Render unto Caesar depicts the famous attempt at entrapment, where the teachers of the law present Jesus with a catch-22. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? And you know what happens next. Give me a coin. Whose image is on it? Caesar's. Then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. That should help us ponder the question, what kind of authority, what kind of power does the true king exercise? No one phrase sums it up fully, I don't think, but St. Paul's account of his struggle with his own personal failings, recorded in the second letter to the Corinthians, speaks of the power of Christ being the power made perfect in weakness. Right away, we think of Christ on the cross as the ultimate expression of divine weakness, which we also call love. Tom Wright, again, puts it helpfully. Our big story, he writes, is not a power story, it's a love story. Right? So Christ on the cross, whose sacrifice is the means of atonement and of our salvation, is also the coming King. A political title. Power made perfect in weakness is of the very essence of the way God created, nurtures, and redeems the world. This is the standard to which Caesar and all Caesars and their successors are held. For, as Jonathan Chaplin has reminded us, government is divinely ordained whether or not it is organized as a democracy. With all due respect to the extraordinary American founders, and I do regard them that way, the origin of government is not a democratic act of we the people. Government's end is to serve God by doing public justice, an end that both empowers it and limits it. Let's learn in this election season, I would invite you to do, to contemplate and own this biblical truth that weakness, divine weakness, does not dislocate the power of God in the world, but really constitutes its truest location. That should give us hope that even our small efforts, like the one you're engaged in, trying to make a good set of choices in this election, even our own small efforts matter. This should, I trust, encourage us to stay engaged or become engaged in the political arena rather than washing our hands of it. After all, washing his hands is what Pilate did. No, if the power of God belongs in politics because Jesus is the coming King, then the people of God belong in politics as well. And the politics Christians practice are also held to the same standards that judge Caesar. The power made perfect in weakness possesses another characteristic of great contemporary relevance. It resists easy pigeonholing into any of these unhelpful categories that sour our political discourse. Now, for Christians, this may have the salutary effect of qualifying our political allegiance, even when we have good reason for our political allegiance, and encouraging us to think and discuss and pray together with our fellow Christians for wisdom, to examine the candidates we want to support critically, and to speak into the political process with demands that government do justice and remember the stewardly service it is supposed to render. If Christians don't make these kinds of demands, I'm not sure who else will. Thank you.